Hi, everybody. This is part two of the Witch Unit video class recording. Hope it's going all right with you. Obviously, it's a sunny day out there. Get out of the glare a little bit. So Sylvia Federici, who wrote this book, does an amazing job of showing us this intersection of classism, the church, land privatization in this new economy, and how it all intersects with degradation of women, especially women who are marginalized, specifically widows, the elderly, the sick, the poor, specifically the poor. So we're going to go back to our share screen. We're going to go back to our PowerPoint presentation. And can you see it there? So, in these different parts of the world, we talked about the merchant class thriving, like Florence and Rome. And then we look at London and we look at Paris, and these universities are flourishing and the art is flourishing. And so, in some places, very well to do women were actually could do quite well. They could publish, they could actually be leaders in convents. So there were little spaces where women, especially women of means or women that were married, were able to squeeze through this new system, this new financial system that started to grow and take over Europe and then the world. And it's called primitive accumulation. We've talked about it a little bit. But essentially, the merchant class, which became really powerful, really wealthy, there were some women that were able to study, say, in Italy, or they were able to be part of medicine. But most of the time, what was actually really happening was, especially for the lay healers, women that had spent generations of knowledge, of this herbal knowledge and caring for women, caring for communities, they started to be squeezed out. This is a picture of showing, it's like propaganda, showing the masculinization of the medical practice and how it's portrayed in English design, picturing an angel pushing a female healer away from the bed of a sick man. The banner denounces her incompetence. So you now have the merchant class squeezing women out. Women are not allowed to join the guilds, the artist guilds, the merchant guilds, where all this money and all this power is being shared in a whole new network for a middle class. You now have this whole new movement of physicians graduating from universities. So women who can't read, have no money, have no access, are not going to these universities. And so that's also a changing institution as well. You have essentially, if we go back to this idea of the fiefdom and we think, oh, the peasants had it so bad, they were really poor as dirt and desperate, and they were slaves to these landowners, right, the nobility. And that is partially true, but believe it or not, women of the Middle Ages did better in a fiefdom or a subsistence economy than they did with this burgeoning primitive accumulation. Primitive accumulation is another word for privatization of lands, and that's enclosures, that's selling off of land, that's charging tenants to live on the land. And there was some pushback back and forth with nobility and church saying we got to do this the right way, but essentially this was something that created the pauperization and the criminalization of the working class. Suddenly we have something called vagabondage, where there are thousands and thousands of desperate, poor, homeless families on these wonderful streets of Venice and London, etc. And so there's a whole new group that is not taking this at all well, especially women. Women were much more at risk for violence, specifically rape, because there was basically no laws against rape at this point, and brothels were taking off. And you might think, oh, women did great working in brothels. Well, that might not have been their first choice, obviously. But once a woman was raped or had a child, outside of marriage, she could no longer be part of the household. She could no longer be part of that community. So she usually found herself out on the street, more likely than not, ended up as a prostitute. So more and more, again, you see women in these roles of having to become more the deviant woman in order to survive. So when women were female serfs, they were working side by side along their male kin folk and friends. There was less differentiation between the physical, the social, psychological, and the subservient. It was an egalitarian measure between men and women. The work was the same outdoors and even indoors. Yes, so when it came to domestic work, suddenly the wage for women was basically non-existent compared to the wage that men were offered. This is a whole new working economy. I know this is a lot of new stuff right now to be listening to. So essentially, when we talk about primitive accumulation, we talk about the end of the common lands that for thousands of years had been guaranteed to be able to provide peasants, serfs, people of the lowest classes, a means to survive, hunting, fishing, cutting wood, so you wouldn't freeze or starve to death. Suddenly, those lands were being enclosed by fences and they were being sold off. And it was a great big land grab around this time period of early modern Europe that specifically gotten by the church and the nobility. The common land was, think about our community gardens of today. That's essentially what so much what this is. It was a place to share, grow land, have festivals, games, gatherings of the peasant community. So all of this started to go away. So a lot of people started to go look for work in cities, but it was not necessarily meant to be. Again, women were not able to make a living wage. And so they often died or had to resort to other means, more deviant means, or becoming sex workers. This is what Michael Foucault, if you ever study him, calls disciplining the body. And it's an attempt by the state and church to transform the individual's power into labor power. And so by the 16th century, there were areas of Western Europe most affected by the Protestant Reformation and the rise of the whole mercantile or merchant class. And you see this emergence in every field, the stage, the pulpit, political and philosophical imagination, a new concept of the person, of the worker. And some of these workers did not go easily. They basically, in a sense, were expelled from the Garden of Eden. There's peasants and artists did not peacefully agree to this work for the wage. More often, they became beggars, vagabonds, and criminals. This is via Silvia Federici. The long process would be required to produce a disciplined workforce. In the 16th and 17th centuries, the hatred for wage labor was so intense that many proletarians, that's the worker, preferred to risk the gallows rather than submit to the new conditions of work. So this great new transformation becomes the new economy in Europe. And these pro-accumulists said, wow, the land could be made more productive if it's privatized. That means putting up fences. That means selling it off. Let's throw some sheep on there because a lot of sheep were taken out during the Black Death. We can grow the food supply to increase wealth and feed the masses. But it didn't increase the food supply. It made more food available for the market and for export as a commodity. 2 centuries of starvation ensued, leaving its people exploited and malnourished. But it's more than that. It was not just this exploitation, it was also the building of capital, divisions within this working class, social hierarchies between gender and class, and then as we get into colonization, of race. Federici argues that capitalism is not this moment of historic progress. The way it was implemented, it created and justified more brutal and insidious forms of enslavement and services that were meant to conceal these exploitations. And now look how we are deplenishing our resources and killing the planet, thinking that privatize more, take up more lands, take up more lands. The whole idea of real estate fits into some of this cycle. Um, I know it's difficult to understand how all this fits together. How does it really affect women in terms of what does this have to do with the witch? So the woman who might have been a widow, who years before would have inherited most or half, at least half of her husband's property and her husband's wealth, that was now sent to the state because people felt that women did not know how to handle money. Whereas before, since the Magna Carta, women would have been allowed, or people who were poor would have been allowed to beg, or would have been allowed to sleep on the church floor or church bench. They would no longer were allowed to do this. So there was this big push to get them into cities in order to become a worker. The value of women's work when they could get it was a pittance. So seamstresses and women of domestic work was just, they were barely paid at all. And the idea of the witch by this point was completely suspect. One of the greatest publications when the printing press came out wasn't just the Bible, it was the Malleus Maleficarum. That means the hammer of witches. And it was this great big guide on how to find, interrogate, put to trial, and put to death the witch. 85% again were women. I'm not going to go into this hyper exploitation slash eroticized view that was used to torture and rape women. I'm already offering too many triggers enough. So, but basically the printing press gave us this document as well as these other documents called the Discovery of Witches, and these different pamphlets, brochures started getting published in multitude, and ways of taking down women who are suspect of being witches. These were also, was given at this time, these publications were a way of affording tools and language for the witch finder. Women became suspect not just for their curing abilities of herbal knowledge, but also their very sexuality came into question and became shamed. Early in the Middle Ages, women were, or it was thought that the devil was some kind of a gnat that you could just say a few prayers over, and then the devil would go away. But by the Middle Ages, the devil was something that was used as the huge Satan, a huge war that the church was trying to control. And they said that women, as second-class citizens and inferior beings, were more susceptible to being corrupt by the devil. And it had to do with the fact that, especially older women, that their wombs were so cold, they needed to be warmed up by the devil. So women as witches were to blame for men's lust. Women as witches were the cause of erotic, excessive passion, and they caused them to be impotent. The hypersexualization of old women is even more ghastly to see. This is the Discovery of Witches. Matthew Hopkins was this witch finder who later on was finally questioned on exactly how he had the authority to become the witch finder general. We might have guessed, at one point, this is just a picture of, the mortality rate, as you can imagine, and the infant mortality rate and the maternal mortality rate. It increased as we started going into this period again of where there were less midwives and this increase in physicians. It took a long time before healthcare really became healthcare as we know it today. So people became more fearful of women as they were being accused of being witches, because another accusation about the witch was that she killed children. And here's a picture of older women as at the Sabbath. So there were just all sorts of campaigns about women and men that really divided the gender relationships. Often, husbands were taught that their wives might be sneaking out in the middle of the night and that they might be um, doing horrible things with certain male body parts, and that it created this huge divide between men and women's relationships. And so I'm going to pause here. Maybe we'll get to part 3. Not sure yet, but thanks for staying tuned. Okay, let's see. Stop share. Stop video.